So I often hear you talk about the concept of critical thinking. Could you talk about its importance and how it relates to self-analysis?
Okay, sure. So, first of all, what we want to understand is what is critical thinking? How's it
Right.
defined and understood? Most people, most scholars and philosophers and scientists understand critical thinking as taking facts and contrasting them, including them, basically using them to reach judgments or conclusions.
Right.
So if a person does not use facts, they basically reach conclusions or judgments by simply using whatever is seen or available. The mistake might be that it feels like you're using critical thought. And this is a very common misuse of critical thought, is that someone is taking coincidence and they're making that fact.
Right.
But in the world of science, coincidence is not, it's usually not, if not absolutely not, fact. It has to be causal. Because of this, this occurred. And because this occurred repeatedly,
Yeah.
which again, I need to have, for good science, I need to have something that is replicatable over and over again. Okay? This is essential for me to understand whether my deduction, my critical thought, is going to produce an accurate outcome. Because if I use information that is not factual, I'm going to reach a conclusion that's also not going to be factual. So if I use gossip as a way to if gossip is my evidence, it's my facts, and I'm using it as a way to reach a conclusion, and it's full of misinformation and it's full of inaccuracy, so of course then is going to be my conclusion and my judgment.
It also could just be based on emotion, couldn't it?
Well, of course, I could use emotion to confuse a fact for misinformation. Correct. But to understand critical thought, the way that I try to share critical thought with the people in the Budokon educational system is I try to share it as a microscope through which we see clearly what is in front of us. So it's very difficult for you to be able to see the difference between a virus and bacteria with the naked eye. So under a microscope, we are able to then make that distinction. And from there we can decide, okay, the fact is this is a virus, or the fact is this is a bacteria, and a virus, as an example, does not respond to penicillin, but bacteria does. So I can treat things correctly if I correctly diagnose them, but it means I need facts. And so critical thinking is so essential because it really is the microscope through which we see everything in our life. And if we begin to use critical thought to deconstruct beliefs that we have formed, these opinions, these ideas that we begin to form, which then become our behavior, we can make big shifts in our lives. We can make big changes. We can make big self-adjustment. And that's the whole game here. It's about being able to see clearly how I've arrived at these judgments and conclusions, and from them I've formed beliefs, and then from the belief I've formed behavior. So it's so important to understand that critical thinking is the way that I must learn to see the world. And critical means that I must be willing to not simply take things at face value, that I must be willing to question
Right. Yeah.
everything I believe. I must be willing to question what facts I use to actually draw my conclusions and my judgments. So a lot of people are not critical enough when they hear or receive information. They're just like, okay, sure, yes, fine. And this type of listening,
it's agreeable by nature.
Agreeable by nature, agreeable oftentimes by nurture. Because you might be agreeable by nature, but you also might be agreeable because agreeing keeps the peace.
Always, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Sometimes you're just agreeable, as you said, by nature. I've always been agreeable. But sometimes you develop an agreeable manner, an agreeable sort of, I would call it a strategy or a tactic. You become agreeable in order to create peace in the household.
Yeah.
You might be the agreeable one because agreeing brings peace to the space. So you would then exchange critical thinking for safety and comfort.
Right.
So it's very important that you be, to a certain degree, disagreeable, and we'll get into that in another tutorial, but you need to be disagreeable, not difficult.
Yeah.
Because disagreeable just suggests that you just don't take things at face value. You actually, they have to make sense to you.
Yeah.
So it's essential that you listen critically and you observe the world critically so that there is this you're in a constant state of discovery. Can't be in a constant state of discovery if you just simply accept things, at face value all the time.
Yeah.
So again, if we're to define critical thinking, it is the microscope through which you observe everything in your life, and it requires you to take facts and use facts to reach judgments. But it also implies, because that's the process, but it implies that you are doing that is your way. In other words, I'm a critical thinker personally, and I encourage you guys to always be critical thinkers. So not just simply taking things at face value, or again, just to go down this rabbit hole for a moment. You can be a critical thinker. There are a lot of people out there that are, as an example, conspiracy theorists who believe and are in some way a critical thinker. The problem is that they don't understand the formula of fact. And scientists must understand the formula of fact. They can't simply accept things as facts if it has not been demonstrated to be factual.
Right. So if it's not proven.
And for a fact to be proven, right, it's got to be replicable. And what's even more important than that is that you have to be able to see that this occurred not because it was a coincidence, but rather because it was causal. So, those two things get confused quite often. So you and I show up at the same time at the grocery store, and we see each other and we say, man, we must be, what a coincidence. But in all actuality, that was coincidence. What would be causal is if you called me and said, hey, meet me at the store at 2, and we both showed up and said, wow, what a coincidence. It is not a coincidence that we're at the store at the same time. You caused that by agreeing to a meeting.
Yeah.
So now in sort of, again, unpacking how a conspiracy theorist might play this game, is that we both show up at the store at the same time. We did not call one another, but it's awfully suspicious that we're here at the same time. And because because it occurred, we put those two things together and say there's something, even though we might both have denied that we called one another, it's so suspicious that we happen to be there at the same time that the person will take that coincidence and they will define that as fact, right? And or characterize that as fact. When in fact, it is actually coincidence that we're there, unless you can prove that we called one another to show up. So coincidental versus causal. Causal is so important to understand because that's how we reach correct and accurate science in our lives. Not just pharmaceuticals, not just through engineering. It's how we reach clear understandings of the world around us in general.
Right.
We cannot constantly use coincidence as as fact. They're not interchangeable.
Right.
They're very, very different. And a lot of people will in the pursuit of knowing and having safety from knowing, they will accept coincidence. They will accept gossip. They will accept hearsay. They will accept intuition. They will accept things that are absolutely unproven as factual to make judgments and decisions about what they believe, how the world is, how it behaves, and then they will become the ambassadors, if you will, of that belief. Again, every belief you form, you are an ambassador of it, because you go out there and you represent that belief. You enact it, you model it, you embody it, and then you either enroll people in it or you at least expose people to it through your behavior. So it's very important that you, as a critical thinker, see the world as and you don't accept things as fact until you can demonstrate through good solid science, good evidence, and causal evidence and causal means that again, as you said earlier, I can replicate this outcome over and over. Clearly this is that cause for that.
Right.
But if coincidentally this occurs sometimes and sometimes it doesn't, that does not make for fact, and it does not make for science.
So if someone's trying to use critical thinking in order to self-analyze, do you think that it's easy for people to steer in the wrong direction by over sentimentalizing circumstance in order to in a way that could serve them and avoid just a more causal approach towards viewing things, so you can strategically and critically think about how you can more consciously develop?
When you say sentimentality, you're suggesting that people may because of some type of relationship they have with the subject, they may not be able to have enough objectivity when they're reaching conclusions.
Like what's that? What could you see that a lot? Like how people could steer towards circumstance because it's a nicer narrative.
Absolutely.
It's more sentimental.
Exactly. The God myth, the narrative of God is very well explained in a very simple, 2-sentence paragraph from the book. I believe it was the story of Pi.
Okay. Life of Pi.
The Life of Pi.
Yeah.
And at the very end, he says, so what's the truth here? Is it that that you were on this boat with a tiger, a crocodile, and an orangutan, or is the fact that you were actually on this boat with your mother and your father and your relatives, and like what's really what's really, getting to the truth here. And he said, well, he goes, really, what's more interesting? That's the question he poses is, you tell me which is the more interesting narrative. I tell you the facts. Right. I tell you the facts, or I give you a narrative and a story that again inspires imagination. And I think that that's what's really fascinating about the God myth, is that we really have this deep connection to mythology and to narrative and to our imagination and to what's possible. And we will oftentimes, in exchange for what is accurate, we will exchange that for what is entertaining and what is interesting to us, rather what is in fact occurring. And that is the nature of the Homo sapien. It's not the nature of all other animals. It's something very specific to our brain and the way that we think. So, do people oftentimes suspend logic in place of fantasy and mythology because it's more interesting? Or will they suspend logic and critical thought in place of how they hope or wish or want the world to be? Absolutely. And it's our work to let go, if you will, of those training wheels. I do understand them as training wheels. I don't think that they make an individual stupid. Okay. I don't think they make an individual ignorant. I think what they are very comforting ways of seeing the world. They're not critical. It's this not critical thought, because if you were to become critical of these myths and narratives, you would start finding that they actually don't have a lot of fact. They're easy to disprove. And that's why most people who believe in God myth, and they don't really like to critically analyze what they believe, because it begins to tear at and destroy the narrative. And it causes them to have to come to terms with oftentimes the unpleasant nature for people, that there is nothingness in the place of somethingness. There is nothingness. So people just really struggle with the idea that when this is over, it's over. So this beautiful myth and narrative that it just continues on and it never ends is so much more comforting than you do this and it's all for nothing. You've worked so hard, you've been forgiving, you've been compassionate, you've been loving, you've been patient, and you're going to the same place Hitler is. That is incredibly disturbing and dissatisfying. That's the perfect word. It's incredibly dissatisfying to people.
That interferes. Do you believe that interferes with the process of becoming a developed critical thinker?
It has to, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You can't. It's in complete contradiction to the very foundation of critical thought. It of course it interferes with it, because it is, in a way, it's kryptonite. It's everything that interferes. And I think this is the perfect word for it. You could even possibly say disrupts, but it interferes or disrupts the process of critical thought, because basically you've suspended critical thought. You've said, you know what, I'm going to just pocket this. And what I'm going to do in place of that is I'm just going to accept this, and I'm not going to deconstruct, I'm not going to analyze, I'm not going to contrast information, I'm not going to challenge any of the information, I'm not going to look for facts. I'm simply going to accept what you say as fact, and then sort of rest in the comfort of that.
Which depending on how deep down that rabbit hole you exist in and live your life in, may be disheartening. But like, what are some of the positives that come from being someone who could critically think and move on towards that path?
I like that question a lot because it's a really rich question of like, what do I get out of this?
Yeah.
It's pretty darn clear what I get out of suspending logic and reason in place of fantasy
Right.
and imagination. I just get comfort, general comfort, because as long as I can hold the space that something's got me and that all this is going to pay off,
Yeah.
I can wake up another day and do it all over again. The minute that I have to rely on my own intuitive process and my own process of judgment, of analysis, I have to also self-regulate is what it comes down to. There's no blueprint, which I think is what's really complex about A versus B. A, there is a blueprint. B, there is no blueprint. I have to create my own blueprint.
Yeah.
And that is very intimidating for many, many, many people. So they would rather buy A or accept A because, again, it's almost like getting IKEA furniture. It just comes assembled.
Right.
You know, or it comes almost ready. You just a few screws and there you have a dresser.
Yeah, there you go.
Versus I'm going to build a dresser.
There's a process. You have to earn that.
I
dresser.
mean, if you really think about the two, and you think about the effort required in designing or following pre-existing design, or having to create a design and then create the tools, have the tools to build something from nothing, the amount of how intimidating that is, or the amount of labor that's involved.
Yeah, it's not comparable.
It's really not comparable.
Yeah.
So what happens is when a person has the opportunity to problem solve and critically think for themselves, what that develops, because we're talking about what is the fruit of the work of critical thought versus the fruit of the work of accepting things and being completely agreeable and just simply accepting someone else's blueprint. The fruit of developing your own and doing that work is that you get to, and I'm going to make this very sort of layman and basic. You get to exercise your mental muscle. You get to develop a very powerful mental muscle. You get to, and what are the fruits of being mentally strong? Durability, emotional threshold, emotional capacity, intellectual prowess, the ability to problem solve quickly, efficiently, your ability to move through the world efficiently and successfully, I think, is incredibly enhanced, or it is enhanced when you are forced to develop the skill of building your own understanding of the world. You're forced then to create your own understanding of ethics, of personal values, all of these things that usually get handed to you through the myth and through the narrative. You have to actually develop through trial and error and mistake making. And by making mistakes, you get to understand how to concentrate, because concentration is a byproduct, or it's a fruit of deep self-study and analysis. So when I can concentrate, I can hold onto or sit with a problem for much longer than this person can.
Right.
Because I've been doing it repeatedly for for as long as I've been practicing critical thought. So I've literally been holding space or states of concentration and awareness and moving parts of thoughts in my mind around and contrasting them and replacing. I've been building like an engineer. I've been doing this over and over and over every day, all day. And this person has been taking everything at face value and just going, oh, okay, they're just moving about their business. So their muscle, the mental muscle of concentration, the mental muscle of awareness of problem, the mental muscle of holding space with that problem to solve and find, or more importantly, discover something. They just don't have.
It's overwhelming.
It's overwhelming. They don't have the practice of it.
Yeah.
They don't, and so that muscle is too weak to actually sustain the work that is developed over here, which again is discovery takes effort.
Yeah.
Discovery requires you to hold space, to concentrate, to witness, and it's very difficult to hold space, concentrate, and witness when you are not being critical about what you're observing. You're just simply taking it in.
Yeah.
And this is basically the most common way a human interacts with reality, but it's also the reason. So it's A, the most common, and B, it's also the reason that humanity is currently where it is at this time.